So today we're going to be talking about family of origin, boundaries, and safe people. We're going to talk about the concept of trusting and what's involved in that. And today is going to be a lot more reflection on your personal story, your experience growing up, what you saw modeled, what you learned about trusting others and boundary setting. So I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to cover. We are going to, like I just mentioned, reflect on our experience in our own family of origins, and I will define that. We will discuss usness and honoring parents and those two competing truths. We'll define differentiation. We'll talk about boundaries, and then we're also going to talk about safe people and the different components that are involved in trusting. Brené Brown breaks that down really well. She's done a ton of research on what exactly is involved in that process. And it's beautiful because that gives us the language to be able to ask for what we need and voice what it is in a relationship that we're having a hard time with or that is compromising trust. I'm going to read this quote by David Benner, which I love. It's from the book, The Gift of Being Yourself. It's one of my favorites. So to start out, he says, Christian spirituality involves a transformation of the self that occurs only when God and self are both deeply known. There's no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of self, and no deep knowing of self without a deep knowing of God. This is why we're doing this work. This is why we are looking back at our experiences in our family of origin today. It is why we're looking at the dynamics with our partners. It's important that we understand ourselves and our brokenness. And also, this work presents beautiful opportunities to be able to experience that agape-type love in our relationships with others, with our partners, and experience healing. So I'm going to talk about what family of origin is. I'll define that for a moment. Family of origin just simply refers to significant caretakers, siblings, basically the people we grow up with. It's our first social group, and it has a major impact on the way we see ourselves, others, God, the world. A lot of times, ways we cope and react to stressors are a result of what we see modeled in our family of origins or ways we coped early on. Awareness around what we experienced earlier on in our family of origins is important because it allows us to take responsibility and ownership of certain things in our life. For example, I remember when I first went to therapy in my early 20s, I remember my therapist talking to me about how I have some people-pleasing tendencies. And I sort of knew that about myself, so it wasn't that surprising, but the language she was using around it was. And I remember having a conversation with my mom, and I was telling her, my therapist was talking to me about these people-pleasing tendencies that I have, and my mom started laughing, and she said, "Oh yeah, I have people-pleasing tendencies, your Aunt Carol has people-pleasing tendencies, your grandma has them." And it just really normalized for me that this is an intergenerational family pattern. This is something in my family line that's been passed down that a lot of the females on my mom's side can relate with. And it's still something that I need to take responsibility for and ownership of in my own life to be able to break some patterns. So that's something I have to work really hard with. Looking at when I fall into people-pleasing, being really clear about what I'm needing and wanting, about my own boundaries. And that's something I've had to work really hard on in my own marriage with Richard. It's also really helpful to understand our partner's experience in their family of origin. A lot of times when I'm meeting with a couple in therapy, I want to understand how each partner experienced conflict early on. What happened when someone got their feelings hurt or they were upset? Did they voice their needs? Was there some passive-aggressive behavior? Did people kind of fall silent and let things go? Was it water under the bridge? Or were there explosions? Was there a comfort around conflict and being able to really press in and talk about it? That's all really important because each partner can have really different experiences. Another thing is our experience early on can shape expectations and hopes in our relationship. One example is what happens when someone gets sick. What was typical growing up? What was normal in their family of origin? It might look really different depending on the partner's experience. And so those are things that are important to communicate about because they can lead to miscommunications. But understanding really leads to compassion, being able to really support one another and show up for each other well and navigate hard conversations. Some reflection questions for you right now to think about are, one, who were you closest to as a child? Who was your go-to person? Who would comfort you if you fell or got hurt? Another one, how was conflict handled in your family? And how was love expressed? I know last week we talked about love languages, these different ways we tend to give and receive love that are meaningful for us. And thinking about those particular ways that love was communicated in your family of origin is really helpful to understand. So we're going to talk about competing truths for a moment. Scott had mentioned in the last couple of classes that part of growth and maturity is really wrestling with some competing truths that we see in Scripture. It's being able to really engage. Sometimes there's no clear-cut answers. So this really takes a lot of discernment. Genesis 2:24 states, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." So here we're talking about usness, this leaving, cleaving, weaving that occurs. This unit is unique and it's sacred. And then Exodus 20:12 states, "Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." This is seen throughout Scripture. We are to honor our parents. We're to care for family. And sometimes these two can come into conflict. I think of a classic example in the Hallmark movies. Oftentimes there's this storyline of boy and girl fall in love. Girl's invited home for the holidays. She arrives at this beautiful home. Mother does not like girl, and the guy stands by the girl's side, and oftentimes it has a happy ending and mother comes around. This can be really tricky. I think it's important to stand by our partners. It's important that there's a lot of seeking to understand and support each other well, because it can be really tricky entering into a new family dynamic, having someone join in what was already existing and this system that's already in place. So with that, I tend to take the position of stand by your partner's side, support them well. And this takes a lot of discernment because we also want to be doing the best job possible to support loved ones in our life. I do believe that hard conversations around boundaries can happen with a lot of love and respect. And I believe that the outcome can actually be an increase of trust and depth in relationship over time. Sometimes it can be really hard and there's tough consequences as well. So there's a lot to navigate here. Be kind to yourself with this. We're having a discussion around it in class. We're going to talk about differentiation for a moment. And this, I believe, is a very helpful concept when we go back and look at those competing truths. Murray Bowen originally described this concept of differentiation, which is really this balance of togetherness and separateness. It leaves room for individual differences. And it's a big part of growth. A healthy sense of self and differentiation allows for one to be part of a group, like a family, while also without feeling compelled to comply with everything. They're able to honor their own viewpoints, beliefs, emotions. Relationships are driven by mutual love and respect rather than guilt, coercion, and obligation. And when there's a sense of that, it really gets in the way of connection and depth and trust. This concept of differentiation is really a lifelong journey. It is not something we attain. It's something we're very much in process with. We become more differentiated as we intentionally engage in our story, recognize what we're needing, what we think and believe, how things land with us, the emotions that we're feeling, our physical reactions as well, that they all give us feedback on where we're at, what we're needing. And then the communication of that is really important. Learning how to do that in a really truthful and gracious way. So differentiation involves responding versus reacting. It is, as we're paying attention to our process and what we're needing, we're then able to choose how we respond versus having a big reaction or finding ourselves doing something that surprises us, like yelling at our partner or locking ourselves in the bathroom, or all the ways it can go sideways. Understanding of where one self ends and another begins without loss of self is part of differentiation and boundary setting. They go hand in hand. One question I often love to ask myself is, am I abandoning my thoughts and feelings, or is my authentic true self showing up right now? It is when we are really engaging in this and becoming more differentiated, and we're owning our thoughts, behaviors, feelings, we're able to really experience true belonging. We're able to really, truly be known because we're not conforming to what's expected of us or what we feel like we need to be doing or showing up in a certain way. We're able to really be seen for who we are. And true connection is actually possible in that space. And then I also love this concept of unity versus uniformity. Richard Rohr talks about this. He says that unity actually involves diversity. It involves us to be our unique selves with our personality and viewpoint and all of the unique things that we bring into a relationship. There has to be diversity and unity. It's not uniformity. That is not what we're called to. There's only one of us. We showing up and really being true to who you are and the passions God has given you and what you're feeling led to do is really important, and it's a gift in this world. And it is through that we experience rich connection with others. We're going to talk about boundaries. So a boundary is simply a property line. Henry Cloud and John Townsend wrote the book on boundaries, and they have a lot of books that kind of sprang off of their original book, Boundaries. I pulled a lot from the book Boundaries in Marriage as I was putting together this material. And they define a boundary in the simplest term of it's a property line. It denotes the beginning and end of something. So there's a sense of ownership and responsibility that comes with boundaries. Boundaries, I think for many people, they can bring this sense of like, oh, I can't do that. Boundaries are selfish. A lot of times I'll hear that. And Henry Cloud and John Townsend really argue that, no, boundaries are actually about self-control, not selfishness. Yes, boundaries can be misused. We don't want to use boundaries to punish our partners or be passive-aggressive or use it to vie for control. That's not what boundaries are about. Boundaries are about self-control and paying attention to what I'm needing, what will actually help me connect with you. And the result is, over time, greater depth and connection. and increased love. So they actually say a misuse of boundaries often results in increased alienation instead of increased love. So there's a difference there. Each spouse must take responsibility for the following things, and they list this, and I love how clear-cut it is. Feelings, attitudes, beliefs, choices, desires, thoughts, values, talents, love. I know we've talked about in previous sessions, Scripture tells us how we need to care for ourselves and how really change starts with us. Scripture does not tell us how to fix our partners. And so this is along the same lines. It starts with us. We need to take ownership for our own feelings, our attitudes. This can come out in I language with partners versus you make me feel so mad. I feel mad when you show up late. It's a subtle shift, but taking ownership for this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm needing. Here are the thoughts I have. That can bring a lot of clarity in relationships. It helps us each know who owns what, and have productive conversations. I think it also can lead to greater empathy. I think it can help us hear one another better. So Cloud and Townsend talk about this triangle of boundaries. They talk about freedom, responsibility, and love, and how these are three things that have existed since the beginning of time. And we are given free will by God. We are given responsibility as free agents, and we are told to love God and love others. When these things exist together, beautiful things occur. Depth in relationship, trust. I remember that first session that we had in the College of Marriage, hearing from various couples in the room. Couples that have been married 50 years, over 50 years, some 60 years plus. And I love talking to couples that have been together for a long time, because often what I hear is this richness and this depth that's developed over time. And when there's freedom, responsibility, and love in relationships, there's a greater knowing, and really people are able to step into who they really are. There's great freedom. And as responsibility is taken for different things in their life, there's a lot of freedom gained in that. I think it can bring a lot of healing to past pain. This love is powerful. Our connection with others and loving relationships rewires our brain. It is one of the most powerful things with neuroplasticity and creating change and shifts. We're going to talk about safe people. A lot of this goes hand in hand. So we all have characteristics that make us both safe and unsafe. Henry Cloud and John Townsend also wrote the book Safe People. I highly recommend it. They really break down different characteristics of unsafe people and safe people. What I want to focus on is they use Jesus as a model, and they describe how three components, dwelling, grace, and truth, are present in safe relationships. Dwelling refers to the ability to connect with someone else and communicate, I'm present with you right now. I see you, which Jesus does so. We see him model this. Grace, being present, this unmerited favor, this communication of I am in your corner, I'm for you. And you are accepted as you are. You are loved as you are. That's really powerful. We all need to hear that. And then truth. Talk about truth as honesty, authenticity. Truth being delivered in a gracious, loving way. That's powerful. It helps us, sometimes shines a light on what we're not seeing ourselves or something we need to take responsibility for. It can lead to greater depth and intimacy when we can trust that someone has our back, they're for us, and they're bringing things to our attention. We don't have to mind read. That's not helpful. We can't mind read. But when we can trust that someone's going to voice what they're needing or what they're experiencing or something they're seeing in us that is unhelpful, it's really powerful. So Brene Brown has an amazing video, which I highly recommend. called The Anatomy of Trust. Brené Brown is a researcher. She's a social worker, PhD out of the University of Houston, and she has studied a lot of topics like shame and vulnerability and is really leading the way in our country in these areas with creating dialogue. And she, in one of her most recent books, Braving the Wilderness, breaks down the components of what humans mean when they say they trust someone. And she uses the acronym BRAVING. She says because to trust someone is braving connection with them. So these 7 components are 1, boundaries, reliability, accountability, vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. So I'm going to go through each briefly. Boundaries is I can trust that you're going to state your boundaries clearly, and I'm going to trust that if you're not clear on my boundaries, you're going to ask. There's conversation around boundaries. If boundaries are crossed, there's a conversation around that too. But there's a desire to honor boundaries. It's attended to. Reliability. Reliability is you are showing up in a consistent manner, and I can trust you to show up in a similar way again and again. I can trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Not just one time, but it's over and over again. Accountability. Accountability is I will make amends if something goes sideways, or if I cross your boundary, or if I do something that hurts you. I'm going to make amends. I'm going to own that. I'm going to acknowledge it. And we're going to have a conversation. And I can trust that you're going to do the same. Vault is really confidentiality. And she describes this as, on one hand, it is being able to trust that when I tell you something, you're going to hold that. And you're not going to go blab it everywhere. Or to even another person, it's held. It's in your vault. On the flip side of that, it's also, I can trust, I see in our relationship as we're doing life together that you also honor the confidentiality of other people. You are not gossiping to me about so-and-so who's getting a divorce, and I see that you honor the confidentiality of others, and you are not sharing what is not yours to share. When people do that, that sends the message they can't be trusted with what we want to share with them either, what are the precious things that we hold. Integrity. So Brené Brown talks about integrity as it is choosing courage over comfort and practicing our values. When we see that people actually practice their values, it increases our trust. Non-judgment. I can ask for what I need, and you can ask for what you need, and we can talk about this without judgment. A lot of times there can be so much judgment we have toward ourselves for needing help, and it can be such a hard thing to lean on others, yet that's a really critical component of building trust. And especially the being able to talk about that in a non-judgmental way. Generosity. I'm going to extend the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. So we work first from this assumption of generosity. I know you have my back. I know you're in my corner. You are for me. And with this, we can still have hard conversations when there's a miss versus something coming out in a passive-aggressive way later. So one final thing I want to mention about the BRAVING acronym and trusting, one of the things Brené Brown mentioned is trust is built over small moments over time. It's through those small interactions of showing up for someone, noticing and choosing to connect. Those are powerful. And in the same way, betrayal can actually happen through small moments over time as well. And she just describes it as it's choosing not to show up and connect with someone in that moment. So it's choosing to disengage in a moment where you see that connection is possible. We could talk a lot about that, but I thought that was so key. The idea of that falls in line with the Gottman's research and what we looked at that first session. It's in the small moments. They're really powerful. So for the couples exercise today, I want you to think about what aspects of the Braving acronym come most naturally for you, as well as which aspects are more challenging. I also want you to think about, from what we've discussed today, what resonates with you, what have you found to be meaningful, along with what's been challenging, or is there anything you're disagreeing with? For homework, I want you to choose one of those challenge areas from the Braving acronym to focus on this week, and just be really intentional with your partner to take some steps. I want this to be doable, so think of a realistic goal, baby steps. We're just moving like on a scale of 1 to 10. Think about maybe where you're at as far as how strong you feel right now, with 10 being really strong, 1 being not strong. And I want you to think about what would it look like to move one number up the scale. So we're just looking for little things. And you're going to practice with your partners this week and just notice what that's like for you. Just a reminder, we're not keeping score. That's not helpful. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm so glad that we are getting to talk about boundaries and safe people and what's involved in trusting and looking back at our family of origins. This is really important work, and we are all in process with it. Remember self-kindness and grace this week. I'm going to leave you with a few resources. So Henry Cloud and John Townsend's books that I used while preparing this talk were Boundaries in Marriage, Boundaries, and then Safe People. Those are great books to look into. I also want to let you know that the Soul Care House, where I work, has a podcast, and there are a lot of different episodes on a variety of topics. Many of them pertain to what we're talking about. So you can find that at Soul Care House Podcast by Elaine Hamilton on iTunes or Google Play. And then the video that I mentioned by Brené Brown is called The Anatomy of Trust. Take care, and we hope to see you next week.